All right. Someone grab those doors back there, please. Making Santa Claus close the doors for us. How about that? Rebecca, Maddie came to me Wednesday night, and she saw the Christmas tree cake thing that you gave her, the cookie. She was like, Miss Rebecca gave me this. I'm like, which one? She goes, the one whose house we stayed in. I'm like, yep, okay, Rebecca Nelson. I'm like, why'd you get that? I helped her clean up. She was very excited about that. All right. Y'all can read this, right? Well, you can read it? Yeah, welcome to Thompson Road Church of Christ. That's good. Tristan's otherwise engaged. We'll get him in a second. There you go. You can't read that? Come on, y'all. So tiny. That's as big as it gets.
I'm surprised I can read that. Oh, there you go.
Is that better?
Yes.
That's all you can get. So,
I'll take it.
what Bible? This is Colossians. Yeah? If you remember a month ago when I was here last, we were talking about Colossians. We're just about to get into the section which explains to us, those who are interested in what in the world Paul's talking about in this book, what he was preaching against or teaching against in this letter. And the remote battery is low. Tristan, I don't think you have it, but it's a lightning port at the bottom of that stainless steel controller. We got to plug that joker in. You could bring it up to the iPad at the Welcome Center and plug it in there, just to get that notification to go away. Oh, you got one. Look at that. Nope, just kidding. Anyway, so in this section that we'll be getting to, hopefully this class, he goes into some stuff that seems off the wall if you don't know the context of what's happening at Colossae. And so when we get there, that will hopefully explain what we've been talking about with the Gnostics so much recently. Now, the side effect of me having upper respiratory infection, pink eye in both eyes, ear infection, and pneumonia is I'm still coughing. So I apologize in advance for this class and my sermon. I'm going to have to do that maneuver into my hand that I will shake your hand with directly afterwards.
Okay, no.
Oh.
I'm a nurse. You cough into your elbow.
Elbow, I see. Well, the problem is this is attached to my elbow, so it'll be louder.
What about the other arm?
I mean, I guess I could. Is that any better?
No, not really.
Yeah.
There's nobody up there, so.
Just don't cough? Yeah. Just don't breathe, is what my wife says. Just don't breathe. Okay. Isn't it great to be back? Okay. Come on now. So when it was small, I had my verse that I started with, that I'm going to start with. But now I have to make sure I'm not jumping too far ahead. Okay, here we are. Let's just start with verse 15. Sound good? Okay, Colossians chapter... No, that's not right at all. No way. In 3? There's no way we talked about verse 12. Oh, food and drink. Yep, that was scruples. You can celebrate Christmas if you want to. That's what Paul intended with verse 16. Y'all read my article for this Connect this week? Oh, I know you didn't. I didn't have anyone say they got a problem with what I said, so I know y'all didn't read it. Okay. Let's just do verse 17. You can read it now all you want. Here's the thesis. The thesis is if you want to think about the birth of Jesus around Christmas time, you're not going to go to hell. If you choose that you don't want to think about Christmas, at the birth of Christ at Christmas time, that's fine too. You can do what you want. If your conscience bothers you by thinking about the birth of Jesus around Christmas time, then don't do it. But if you choose to think about the birth of Christ when people around the world are doing it for religious or non-religious reasons, then that's your decision to make. So if you choose to do so, there are some beneficial things that you can think about during Christmas time. If you don't, then that's fine too. But you can't pass judgment on us that choose to do so, because verse 16 in Colossians chapter 1 says, whatever they were doing was fine for them to do, whether it be Jewish or Gentile. And so there's a huge issue here when it comes to some of us who have been taught differently than that. Okay? Yeah, I got no emails. I got no phone calls besides Betty. No folks had a problem with me. And definitely Betty has called multiple times saying she's got a problem with me, but that's nothing new. Okay, verse 17. These are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Now, the word substance here, especially in the English, I mean, it's a little bit there in the Greek, but not so much as we would like it to say. But in the English, the word substance is a compound word, right? So you have sub, first three letters. What does the beginning of sub seem to indicate? Below. Okay, that's great. Sub. So a submarine goes under the water, right? Last time I checked. And then stance, if you use that word in the English, what does that indicate to you? Okay, stand, rooted, planted, standing firmly is the idea. So if you have substance as a compound word there, you have the under stance, the under position. So the shadow of things to come, meaning the things of the Jewish law which folks were still doing out of tradition and custom and heritage and culture, not doing it for religious purposes per se, like keeping the Sabbath and enjoying the Passover meal if you were Jewish, still doing those things even though they were Christians. Those were shadows, but the substance, the thing that stands underneath, the meaning behind the text, belongs to Christ. And so what Paul is saying here is if you have people in Colossae who are Jewish by heritage, by culture, and they want to continue to keep the Sabbath, if they want to continue to do the feast days and the fast days that were Jewish in nature, but they're still belonging to Christ, then there's no judgment placed upon them because that's their choice to do so. They understand that Christ is the fulfillment of the law, but if they want to continue to keep those special days holy and have those holy days, those holidays, then that is fine. And then verse 18, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, meaning depriving your body of what it needs or even harming your body physically, or worship of angels. And so now we're kind of getting to the point of what the Gnostics were doing. And Paul is calling them out directly based on their teachings, right? So they were insisting that you either flog or deprive your body of what it needs. They are worshiping angels or messengers. The more you learn about the Gnostics, especially in the 2nd century, because all the apocryphal books of the New Testament really have a flavor of Gnosticism in them, is the idea that God, the big God, has sent down other gods or messengers over time, and the ones that you listen to are giving you special insight into the wisdom of God. Therefore, you are the knowing ones, the Gnostic, because you have that teaching. And they would claim that Jesus is just the last one of those messengers that came, and he was the best messenger, but he was just a messenger of God. He was not God himself, which Paul's got a problem with just theologically. And so he's saying here, if you are someone who understands Jesus and you've received the word of the gospel and you're living in the gospel, don't let someone say that you're wrong or disqualify you because you're not depriving your body of what it needs, or you're worshiping angels, going on in details about visions, which is how they would receive that special knowledge, quote unquote, if you're a Gnostic, puffed up or prideful, without reason by his sensuous mind. So again, there's that pendulum swing, which is so common when it comes to these doctrines. So either your body is, your flesh is evil, therefore punish your body to be more spiritual, or it doesn't matter what you do in your body and therefore give into sin because your body's sinful anyway. That's the pendulum swing of the two extremes. And then verse 19, and not holding fast to the head. Who's the head? Christ is the head of the church, right? That's Ephesians. That's just right there. And the Gnostics were not placing the proper emphasis on who Jesus was. He wasn't simply just a messenger, a prophet sent from God. He is God himself in human, physical, fleshly form, from whom the whole body, the church, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. This is an echo of 1 Corinthians, right? Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. That's the idea. If, with Christ, you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? And here's an example of the kind of regulations that the Colossian heresy, the Gnostics, were teaching the Christians in Colossae. Here's the regulation. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. So they're placing those regulations on those Christians, referring to the things that all perish that are being used according to human precepts and teaching. So we pause right there. Paul's really going after them here at this particular point. And he's saying that they are wrong because they are judging you unworthy because you're not of a special class, but you are in a special class belonging to Christ. Y'all with me? Okay, verse 23. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, so again, harming your flesh to be more spiritual, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. They don't make you more holy because you're depriving yourself. This is a whole other thing than you putting off the pleasure of the short term for a long-term investment in eternity. That's a whole different conversation. But this is talking about, hey, if you don't have lunch after worship today, God will love you more. You'll be more holy. Anybody on board with that idea of skipping lunch after worship? I know I'm not. Okay.
That just makes me hangry.
Yeah. I like to say I never get that way, but I do. I do. Okay, chapter 3, so-called, verse 1. If then you have been raised with Christ, because they're Christians, they've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. So again, a big kicker here I always love to bring in is how familiar this is if you know the book of Hebrews. So the book of Hebrews emphasizes why Jesus is the best. The fancy English word for that is he is preeminent. Now, I for so long didn't know what that word preeminent meant. And I'm like, yeah, it's a good religious Bible word. But all it means is that he is better than everything else that came before him. He is the best. And one of the reasons why Jesus is the best, the fruition of the law, is he's the best high priest. And the argument from Hebrews is that, well, if you have a human high priest, he never gets to sit down because he's always making animal sacrifices to cover the sins of mankind. But Jesus is the best. He's preeminent because he made one sacrifice and then he gets to sit at the right hand of God himself. That's why he's the best. Now, I love that sentiment because it's what the Bible teaches, but also because I figured it out on my own. It's one of those things as a kind of a newer convert I was reading Hebrews. I'm like, what's the big deal about him sitting down at the right hand of God? And I did my own research and I read my own material and I saw it. I'm like, because he gets to sit down. I'm like, whoa. And I'm like, this, there's little things that you figure out without someone telling them to you. For me, are a little bit more special because you see it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. All right. Anyway, verse 2. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. So that's in direct contrast to what the Gnostics have been teaching in Colossae, for which Paul is writing this letter. Because he's saying, if your citizenship, your existence, your life is in heaven, why are you so concerned about what you do here on earth? How much you fast, how much you feast, how much you hurt your own physical body? Why do you care that much? Because that's where your life is. So focus on that, not on this, which is a great lesson for all of us because we have a lot of people that are around us who want to tell us in the world that all that matters is that you are true to yourself and that you have your own truth and that your own experience is what lends your knowledge about this life. And that's valuable. It's not really, because our life's up there with him. He's sitting at the right hand of our Creator God. That's the emphasis, not what we do here. Again, there's the proper balance there. We can't be all focused on that and neglect the things that we have to steward while we're here, but at the same time, that's not the emphasis. Okay, so here's the teaching from Paul, verse 3. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, by the way, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. So here's the invitation statement from Paul. Therefore, put to death what is earthly in you. And here's a definition of what is earthly in this context. Now, the word sexual immorality, it's a good English word, 2 words, to define this umbrella category of unacceptable, unlawful, unhealthy sexual relationships. The Greek word behind sexual immorality is the word porneia, from which we get the English word pornography. Now, this is where some folks kind of get confused because they say, well, see, isn't watching pornography the same as this sin by which, from Matthew 19:9, I can divorce my spouse? It's a whole other conversation, I'll tell you that. But no, that's not legitimate for its purposes. So you could read porneia as fornication, which is the sexual act between someone and someone who's not lawful for them to have in a sexual way. But the umbrella term, if you will, of immoral sexual behavior is that right here in this context. Okay, so that's one. Secondly, impurity, that which is not pure. Okay, we have passion, which passion is good for the English word, but the idea of passion here is going after your passions with a sinful intent. For evil desire and covetousness. And here's an interesting definition of Paul of what covetousness truly is. Covetousness, which is idolatry. So what does it mean to be covetous? It's an old English word. Okay, want something that's not yours. Very simple working definition, right? Does it belong to you? Is it yours? No. Do you want it? Or are you going to take it? That's the idea. And so what Paul does here is he explains what's so wrong with covetousness by defining it properly from God's perspective. Covetousness, wanting what is not yours and desiring to take it or even taking it, equates to what in God's view? Idolatry. You're putting that thing that you want, which is not yours, in the place of where God should be. That's a bigger issue, isn't it? Just wanting things that are not yours is a problem in and of itself, but from God's perspective, you're elevating the value or worth of that thing that you want, which is not yours, to where He should be. Because you should want Him and Him alone. That's easy to say, difficult to live out, right? Okay, any questions?
Did this letter stick in
Did it affect change? Well, I mean, that's hard to pin down historically. Yeah. I would say that it was valuable enough for them to read it publicly to their assemblies, to copy it and copy it and copy it and copy it and share it. And so when you come to the end of the 2nd century, everybody know Paul wrote Colossians. They all had a copy of it. To me, that's, okay, let me pause. Yeah, I mean, what you'll see, especially in the writings of John, which are the later documents that were produced of the New Testament, John, in every single thing he writes, is fighting against this idea of Gnosticism. So, I mean, all the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Paul, the Gospel to the Hebrews, all these different Gospels that were written in the 2nd century, not by an apostle, but they claimed that title, they're all Gnostic. They're all saying, well, what actually happened was Michael, the archangel, came down and he possessed Jesus, the man who was not God, but just a sinful human. But Michael inhabited his body, and therefore, when he was on the cross, right before he died, Michael left his physical body. So his body could die, but the spirit was cleansed. That's Gnosticism. He's saying that Christ, Jesus, is not human and God at the same time. So all those documents from the 2nd century that were written that have a Gnostic flavor or feel to them, or just outright Gnostic teachings, they proliferated. But were there people that looked at this letter and they understood the truth in contrast to what the Gnostics were teaching? Absolutely.
Yeah, I was wondering if the top dog Gnostic in Colossae was in the assembly when this letter was first read.
I mean, that'd be great, wouldn't it?
I mean, I just,
To be a fly on the wall of that assembly. I mean, here he is. I've got a special revelation from God from a vision last night. Let me show it to you. And go, hey, real quick, before you speak, we got a letter from Paul. And then they just read this, and he's like, oh.
he might have been moved on down the street, got his own little thing.
Yeah, well,
I think the assembly when they first started.
there's a lot of cool, quote-unquote, historical information that we get from the 3rd century, where they're like, well, we all know what happened after, the book of Acts took place. And so there's all these legends of what the people from the book of Acts did afterwards. I mean, remember Simon the sorcerer? So you have Philip, right? Talks to the eunuch. He goes back to the town. And right before that, Peter comes to visit, and they see that everyone in Samaria is doing pretty well, being Christians. And they find a guy who's a sorcerer. And his job is to perform these magic tricks to say they're from God, and then to get money from that. So he's like, he saw a real miracle done by people that Peter laid hands on. He goes, hey, can I pay you for that ability to do miracles? And Peter's like, you better repent of that wickedness right now. So what they say in the 3rd century is that guy, he left there, where'd he go? He went to Rome. He fooled all of them. So he tricked all the Romans. Even Caesar himself knew about this guy, Simon the sorcerer, and they made a statue in his image. And then Peter came to Rome and saw the same guy. And all this stuff is kind of like, of course, third-hand knowledge. But it's interesting to see what they thought took place when you have someone who's doing wrong and they get run out of town, they go somewhere else and do the same thing. So to say it's possible, absolutely. Okay. Any questions? It's a whole other rabbit I could chase for too long. It's what you're good for, asking, what about that rabbit over there? Yeah, I can chase him. Okay. All right. All the sinful things in verse 5, don't do that. All right, real quick. I knew a guy one time. He was a father, and he had a son who was a teenager, so you can imagine the dynamic. He was law enforcement, and he's a Texan, and so you can kind of imagine a cowboy and law enforcement, what he looked like, what he sounded like. I was hanging out with the teenage son. It was me, him, and Melissa, and we were in the car, and we had lunch after church or whatever we were doing. and his mother called him on a cell phone. He answered it, didn't like what the mom had to say, and slammed the phone, back when you could do that, slammed the phone and hung up on her. And I just looked at him and I said, "Did you just hang up on your mom?" He's like, "Yeah." I go, "Oh, okay." And then immediately his phone rang, and I saw his dad's name on the caller ID. And I go, "You better answer that." He goes, "Okay." So I hear, because his dad is Texan, law enforcement, good Christian guy, and he just goes, "Hey, Austin, did you just hang up on your mother?" And he goes, "Yes, sir." He goes, "Don't do that," and then hung up on him. That's all he needed, was to hear from his dad, "Don't do that." There's a lot more in the subtext of that conversation than just, "Don't do that." Right? You can probably imagine. Do it again, there's going to be consequences. You're going to get beaten, whatever it was. And so that's all he needed was, "Don't do that." And I was driving. We were parking in a parking lot. We were parked in the parking lot. Probably Mexican food, Sunday afternoon. I mean, where else can you go? So in verse 5, that's the memory that comes to mind. Paul's saying, hey, if they're telling you that you need to be involved in these areas of sin, don't do that. That's not where you need to be. A lot of subtext is there, but Paul's just saying, if that's what they're preaching, is these things aren't an issue, they're wrong. Verse 6, here's the reason why it's wrong. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. Okay? And then he kind of goes a bit more Pauline here, verse 7. And these you too once walked when you were living in them, so they were no longer living in them. Is it true then that you can live in such a way where you're living in these kinds of sins? Interesting reason to bring that up. Okay, anyway. But now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do you think that the last one here in verse 8 seems to imply that the way of speaking for a Christian ought to be different than the world? If we sound and talk just like the people that are in the world that don't know Jesus around us, are we in the wrong for doing that? I would think so.
Well, we're a representation of him.
Right.
We're trying to be more like him, and if we're not doing away with those things, how is anyone else supposed to know that we're a Christian and follower?
If we're following Jesus and we want to pattern our manner of life after the way he lived, we don't see that kind of behavior from our Lord. He talked a whole lot. I mean, you think if he was talking obscenities, we'd have some writing about that, but we don't. In 4 different gospel accounts, those that followed him the closest, that knew him the best, even by direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that's never mentioned once. Interesting thing for Paul to bring out here. I mention that because sometimes we have folks that are maybe a little bit more inexperienced in the faith, and they don't see what the big deal is about using certain language. And I'm put myself in that category when I was a new convert. I've told my story about being in Bible class and dropping the F-bomb, right? Brand new baby convert, didn't know it was wrong, had no idea. That's the way I talked in high school. And the sweet little, blue-haired ladies gave me grace because they knew I was a brand new Christian. And so after I realized, I shouldn't talk that way, they go, yeah, we heard you in Bible class. We appreciate your thoughts, but, you got some work to do. I'm like, yeah, I will do my best. And so far, so good. Okay? Any questions about that one before we move on? Ted?
I go to the North Coast on Mondays, and it's just like an engineering office, probably a dozen people or so, and it's like every day I can hear at least multiple times a day a cuss word come out. Somebody's aggravated at the computer or just normal conversation. It's not as bad as like somebody from Boston, which I've heard them talk, but it's
You're saying the Boston accent is worse to you than obscenity?
No, because they use obscenity.
Oh, yeah, that's part of the Boston accent. Gotcha. Okay, all right.
It's just because I try myself not to use it so much, it really strikes me sometimes that even just the normal, and some of them are Christian or profess to be, or some, it's just sprinkled out throughout their day.
Yeah, I think people maybe have different sensitivities to it. Like I know some people, they will not watch a movie because it has curse words in it. I get that. If that's where that's who you are when it comes to that kind of material and media, I mean, more power to you. Personally, for me, it's just like white noise. I don't even hear it. I'll recommend books or movies and not even think about the cursing in it because I just don't hear it. It's not a part of who I am. I don't use that kind of language, so I don't even register it. But some people do that, and that's fine. I do know one guy. I'll tell you one story about this real quick because it means a lot more than I can explain to you now, but it means a whole lot to me. As I was in Charlestown, West Virginia, in my first preaching, my first place where I preached, and there was a guy named Drew, and he worked for the DOD. I think everywhere I've gone, there's been like some kind of government or military adjacent thing. I grew up on the east coast of Virginia. It's all like SEALs and Navy and stuff. So I get all contractors for NASA. That's my mom's job. So it's interesting how I've always kind of gone to where the government people are. It just seems to work out that way. Yeah, they are. And so Drew, he worked for the DOD in D.C., and he quote-unquote worked with vaccines, which is a very nice way to say he's not going to tell me anything else about what he's doing. But before that, he was a sergeant in the Army before he retired. And he told a story one time about this context, about this idea about obscenity and profanity, especially being in the Army. I mean, apparently they use some language. Who would have thought? And he was a drill instructor for a little while. And there was a, what's it called? Not a recruit? Boot camp guy? One of those guys, recruit, okay, in boot camp. And he messed up. And so he, as the DI, went over there and chewed him out for making that mistake, as you do in boot camp, from what I'm told. And so he went over there. The difference was he didn't use a single profane word at this boot camp recruit, inductee, right? And so one of the other DIs, drill instructors, came over and said, "How did you do that?" And he goes, "What?" I'm like, "How did you, in that tone, as a drill instructor, not cuss this guy out?" He goes, "Oh, I don't cuss." He goes, "You're in the Army. You're a sergeant in the Army. What are you talking about?" Of course, he's like, "No, it's not in me. Therefore, it's not coming out of me." And that was kind of his proof text for, from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. It's a proverb, right? If it's not in me, it's not going to come out. And so it's an interesting perspective he had, being in the Army, being a sergeant, being a DI, and he was one of our guys who should have been an elder, in my opinion. So I love that little moment where he got to drop that on us in our 30-person congregation and just let us know kind of who he is. And you see it from his children, the way he reared them. They're great people because of who he was. And, of course, the mother. Okay, anyway, verse 19, do not lie to one another. So lying to each other is bad. Don't do that. Right? Seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and you put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So again, dropping one more little piece of ammo there against the Gnostics. We're being patterned after the image of Jesus, who is the image of the Creator God. They're all the same. We're being more like Jesus, more like God. Everything's equal in that conversation. So he's not just an angelic messenger. He is God in the flesh. God with us. Emmanuel was his original kind of given name, if you will.
Just that phrase,
Yeah,
which is being renewed in knowledge,
yeah.
kind of implies that this is
Well, of course.
Not an overnight change.
The only one that I can say with some certainty kind of was an overnight change is the Apostle Paul. Because he was going full speed one direction, and then Jesus woke him up to the reality of what he was doing, and then we kind of see him go full steam the other direction of making more Christians instead of persecuting them.
That he went full steam toward Christ.
Yeah.
He said, I pressed on toward the mark of the high calling of God. It's not, I have arrived, therefore I can sit.
Well, we've already read the text where it says, I've not arrived yet. And that's Paul saying that. If Paul can say, I'm not there yet, I'm still working, then surely we can. Keep that in mind that Paul had something that we try to emulate as he emulated Christ. That's going to be our introduction to our sermon this morning. So keep that in the back of your mind that Paul is a good example to us because he was absolutely human, but he had a lot of positive aspects to his Christianity that we can emulate. So we can be envious of some things about the Apostle Paul. So, okay. Thank you guys for your attention this morning. As we continue going through here, we'll see, again, more about the Gnostics in contrast to what the Christian doctrine or teaching was and kind of how we can use that in our lives as well. So, okay. We'll pause here in verse 10 and pick up in verse 11, Lord willing, next week. Thank you for your time and your attention. We'll be dismissed now for about 18 minutes before worship begins.